Thank you and welcome. I'm Reverend Stephen Braddock, President of the Florida Keys Outreach Coalition, and I'm pleased to welcome you all here this morning for searching out solutions, constructive alternatives to the criminalization of homelessness. Today's event is sponsored and coordinated by the Monroe County Homeless Services Continuum-of-Care with enthusiastic and generous support from the Florida Department of Children and Families, the Key West Interfaith Ministerial Association, Lower Keys Medical Center, Florida Keys Outreach Coalition, One Human Family Foundation, Episcopal Charities of Southeast Florida, Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Miami, the law offices of Samuel J. Kaufman, the Monroe County BOCC, Digital Island Media, and the Florida State Coalition for the Homeless. I have the privilege of introducing our panelists, but before I do that, I would like to recognize some of our community policymakers and public servants who are with us today. Perhaps you can wave or feel free to stand if you wish, so our guests know who you are. Monroe County Commissioner Heather Carruthers, Key West City Commissioner Tony Yanez, Monroe County Commissioner David Rice, Key West City Commissioner Jimmy Weekly, City Commissioner Terry Johnston, representing Congressman Joe Garcia, Rita Cotter. On behalf of State Representative Holly Rasheen, Ellen Muir, our State Attorney, Catherine Vogel, Monroe County Assistant Attorney, Pedro Mercado, Key West City Attorney Sean Smith, Assistant City Attorney Chris Bridger. Sheriff Rick Ramsey is not in the room yet, but he is on his way. The Sheriff's Attorney Patrick McCullough is here. Key West Police Chief Donnie Lee, joined by Captain Torres and Officer Stephen Torrance. Chief Assistant Public Defender Trish Doherty Gibson, joined by Assistant Public Defenders Andrea Gibson, Denora Caceres, Tiffany Curry, Michelle Perez, Jason Smith, and Robert Lockwood. Key West Mayor Craig Cates is here, and representing the Department of Juvenile Justice, Elaine Thompson. Before I forget, those of you who are attorneys, we've arranged for continuing legal education credits at no cost to you, so if you would like to take advantage of that, please stop back at the registration table at the conclusion of today's forum, and we'll provide you with that information so that you can claim those credits. So on to our panel. Amy Sawyer, joining us from the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. She is a principal representative and a bridge between the work of the full council, states, and local communities. The United States Interagency Council on Homelessness is an independent agency within the federal executive branch and is composed of the 19 members of the President's Cabinet and heads of federal agencies. She is responsible for facilitating the strategic implementation of opening doors, specifically in the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. As a regional coordinator, she convenes stakeholders at every level of government and the private sector, encouraging implementation of strategies that maximize the impact of federal resources and supporting strategic planning efforts. Ms. Sawyer also disseminates information about proven practices, bridge linkages among communities, and shares practical resources to support community efforts and foster momentum through shared knowledge and cross-community collaboration. Prior to joining the Interagency Council, Amy coordinated the homeless initiative for the city of Asheville and Buncombe County, North Carolina. Her work there helped the community make a marked impact on chronic homelessness and apply lessons learned to rapid rehousing, minimizing the impact of the housing crisis for that community. In 2012, the community reported a 75% decrease in chronic homelessness. This work, paired with her experience in family and child social work and a Master's of Science in Human Development, has allowed Amy to bring a unique mix of compassion, vision, collaboration, and evidence-based approaches to her work. Joining us from the Southern Legal Counsel is Kirsten Clanton. The Southern Legal Counsel is a Florida statewide nonprofit law firm dedicated to equal justice for all and the attainment of basic civil and human rights. Ms. Clanton directs the Council's Homeless Advocacy Project, a statewide project to protect and defend the civil and human rights of homeless individuals and their advocates through litigation, policy advocacy, community education, and outreach. She is frequently invited as a speaker on the criminalization of homelessness and provides technical assistance to advocates and lawyers nationwide on the civil rights of homeless persons. Ms. Clanton is the current chair of the Committee on Homelessness for the Public Interest Law Section of the Florida Bar. She is a member of the Florida Bar and the bars of the U.S. Middle, Southern, and Northern District Courts of Florida and the 2nd and 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Ms. Clanton received her JD with honors, and she has an MA in Latin American Studies and a BA in Spanish with honors, all from the University of Florida. Mr. Benjamin Waxman is a partner with the Miami criminal defense firm Robbins, Tunkey, Ross, Amsel, Rabin, and Waxman. He received his BSB from the University of Minnesota and his JD with honors from the University of Miami. He is a member of the Colorado and Florida bars and is certified by the Florida Bar as a criminal appellate specialist. His practice consists primarily of criminal appeals and post-conviction relief work. He has handled matters in every Florida appellate court and nearly every federal court of appeals. He is an active director of the Miami chapter of the ACLU, a former director and executive committee member of the Florida ACLU, and an active member and former director of the Miami chapter of the Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. He was the lead counsel in the case Pottinger versus the City of Miami, a national precedent-setting, successful class action suit brought on behalf of thousands of homeless persons against the City of Miami for violation of civil rights. And finally, David V. Peary is the chairperson of Camillus Health Consumer Advisory Board, which represents the patients of St. Camillus Health, a community clinic that serves the homeless population of downtown Miami. David is also a class representative in the Pottinger versus City of Miami lawsuit and settlement agreement that protects certain rights for homeless persons in the City of Miami. He is active in a number of homeless rights organizations, including the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. David earned his law degree from George Washington University and volunteers his time as a legal researcher with the Florida ACLU. We had expected to also be joined by Mr. Michael Stoops from the National Coalition on the Homeless. Unfortunately, Michael was detained in Washington this week and was not able to join us, but we're hoping that he'll be down in the next several months. So, moderating for us today is the Reverend Randy Becker, who needs little introduction, I'm sure, to most in this room. He's a well-known community champion in our community. He is a Unitarian Universalist minister. He is the pastor of the One Island Family Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and he is the president of the Key West Interfaith Ministerial Association. So would you please give a welcome to our panel, and I will then turn it over to Reverend Becker.
We're here today to search for solutions which can best be done by having accurate information, also by having open minds, not carrying preconceived ideas or notions, but seeing what emerges in our consideration together. So this is an invitation to hear, to consider, and then later to respond to what we hear. In my ministerial tradition, of course, we always begin any gathering with some words of ingathering, of invocation, of inviting the spirit we want to have here within this space. So I invite you to think about that which you hold most central and most important to you, that sense or source of values that informs you, and holding that in your mind and spirit for a few moments, we ask that the spirit of goodness and reflection and wisdom and care and compassion be here, that in this time we might be able to respond less out of fear and more out of values, less out of reaction and more out of vision. May the sense of us being one human family be in this space this morning and in all mornings. May we bring our best selves to the consideration, and in that spirit do the work we feel called to do in the world. Blessed be, and amen. Let me give you an overview of where we're going. We're going to do this without a break, which means you're on your best behavior to take care of your needs. So if you need coffee, and the decaf will be coming in a few moments, or tea, or regular coffee, you go take care of it. More importantly, there's chocolate over there. And being committed to diversity, there's diverse chocolate over there. If you need the bathrooms, they're out either side of where you came in from the elevator. You get up and you go, you come back. We're just going to keep on going. If you need to stretch your legs, maybe you can just pace in the back. In the sense, take care of yourselves. Take care of yourselves so you can attend to what's going on. Because what we're going to be doing is hearing a series of presentations. Each of the presenters will speak for a while, and then the other members of the panel will have an opportunity to either comment or ask a question of the presenter. And then we'll move on to the next presenter, the next, and the next. When all the presenters have spoken, and each have had a chance to do a quick summary, then there's going to be time for questions from you. And we're going to have some 3x5 cards. You can put those questions on. They'll come up to me, and I'll ask the questions. You can either make them to the whole panel or to one of the specific people. And for a period of time, we'll process questions. And then at the end, there'll be a time for open comments from you, the people, for about 2 minutes each, from this microphone over there, to say whatever you want to say that you think should be the record of this occasion. And that's basically our format for today. And we're in the order we're going to talk, which will make it easy for me as moderator to know who comes next. So, Amy, I welcome you to Key West and to this opportunity to help bring us information, insight, and understanding. Welcome.
Thank you. I have to say I'm really excited to be here in Key West as you confront the challenges of homelessness in your community. It's a really complex issue, and I know that you've put a lot of energy into solving it. So I think today is a really important day because we'll be searching out solutions and discussing really how we can apply them. On behalf of Labor Secretary Tom Perez, which is our chair, and Laura Zeilinger, our executive director, I'm honored to represent the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. We represent the collective action of 19 federal agencies as well as state and local partners, because without that type of collaboration, we will not end homelessness. And as I sat here and heard the introductions and heard who was in the room with state and local partners, public and private stakeholders, it's clear that you have the ingredients you need to solve the problem. And the issue of criminalization in the United States is extremely serious to us. And in fact, it's garnered attention internationally as well. Just last month, a committee of the United Nations questioned representatives from the State Department about what we're doing to address it. We know we have the power to end homelessness, and we know that the power to shift away from ineffective policies to real solutions comes from strong local leadership and collaboration. And Key West has the foundation to get there, and USICH is fully your partner in this process. And I look forward to today's conversation. So I thought I'd talk about 3 things today. First, I'd like to frame the issue. I want to clarify about what we mean when we talk about criminalization of homelessness and why these measures aren't an effective response. I'd also like to take a look at what we know about criminalization and the reasons why some communities feel compelled to adopt criminalization policies, even though they have an adverse effect on individuals and the community. And third, I want to talk in detail about what some effective alternatives are and what evidence-based practices exist, and what actions can be taken to implement them. So first, what is criminalization of homelessness? We know from evidence that criminalization is not a solution to homelessness, and in fact, it often exacerbates it. And as many of you know, it's the practice of legislating and enforcing against basic life-sustaining activities, the things that most of us can do in the privacy of our own homes because we have a home. So it's things like bathing, sleeping, cooking, eating, lying down, going to the bathroom, or storing personal belongings in public spaces. Places where people have to exist because they don't have a home of their own. Essentially, they're experiencing homelessness. So not only is criminalization not a solution to end homelessness, but the U.S. Interagency Council believes that it is definitely the wrong response. Why do we believe this? Well, we know that criminalization is a direct barrier to housing, which is the solution to homelessness. And it has deep, lasting effects on people, which contributes greatly to negative impacts on adults, but particularly youth. And we know that criminalization is costly to the community, and it consumes substantial state and local resources through high-cost services like jails or emergency visits or court visits. And all the time, it's not reducing homelessness. And in addition to the public cost, individuals who are arrested or fined for active living crimes now have a criminal record, which makes it harder for them to access the various services and housing they need to end their homelessness. These policies create barriers for individuals and do not provide a permanent solution. So now that we know what criminalization is, we know, and I've talked about why it's not the right approach. I'd like to share just a very brief issue of homelessness and how criminalization reared its head, and the opportunity we have to move away from these practices so that we can solve homelessness, not just for people experiencing it, but really for the whole community. So very briefly, a span of a couple hundred years in about 3 minutes. How did we get here? It's not surprising to anyone that poverty and housing instability have existed since our nation was created. And some of the early responses, some of you may know of the poorhouse. This is where people who were supported by, there were places where people could go when they could not support themselves. And they weren't in a healthy place, and it was somewhere where people ended up being isolated from the community. And that's sort of an early response of how people started responding in a more criminal way to homelessness. But over time, as we learned more about why people couldn't care for themselves, we actually started to specialize institutions to help with people's mental health or their physical health. But that still meant that people were isolated and away from the community. So an awareness of this, along with financial and other social issues, led to deinstitutionalization. So starting in the mid-50s all the way to 80s, people were exited from hospitals, but there was really no strategy to connect them to housing or other supportive services that they needed. And concurrently, along with this, our country really began to see a lack of affordable housing. So subsequently, there was many people in our community who were experiencing homelessness or experiencing crisis of housing. And we had an amazing response by groups of community members coming together to respond to the crisis, trying to provide emergency shelter, emergency food, but still with no connection to housing, homelessness just began to increase more and more. And it became visible. It was something that people couldn't ignore. And along with this, we also had some great growth in our communities. We started to see downtown revitalization and downtown improvements. And this is where the clash of cultures started. Commerce, art, public space, and festivals didn't always mingle well with people who were down and out. And public discourse started to focus on individuals in downtown areas, misinformation, what it meant to be experiencing homelessness, and even blaming people who are homeless. But luckily, we have the opportunity to shift away from these types of approaches to some real solutions. There's new opportunities through federal, state, and local collaboration and community plans to end homelessness to really set a stage to how we can respond to people who, with no other means, have to live on the streets. So in federal law, through the HEARTH Act, Congress has called on communities to find alternatives to criminalization. Our federal partners fund a wide range of housing and services vital to ending homelessness that can be and are leveraged in local communities, including Key West. And Opening Doors, the federal strategic plan to end homelessness, sets forth a bold goals and strategies. And included in this plan are a clear set of strategies designed to eliminate the impact of criminalization. And the vision of Opening Doors is simple. No one should experience homelessness, and no one should be without a safe, stable place to call home. So, what are the solutions? And what are the alternatives? Permanent housing is the solution to homelessness. It should be at the center of every plan and activity surrounding the issue, and while it's complex, reorienting your system to focus on housing is the solution. So to think through how we implement these solutions, USICH published Searching Out Solutions, and then we've continued to build our field of knowledge in the area by working with communities like yours. And above all else, we've learned that person-centered community engagement must be a centerpiece of your efforts to end homelessness. Communities need to meaningfully engage people who have experienced homelessness, as well as outreach workers, law enforcement, volunteers, funders, service providers, business leaders, faith groups, everyone in all aspects of the implementation and planning. When the larger community is informed and working together, people can get connected to safe and stable housing. We can no longer leave it up to people experiencing homelessness to solve the crisis of homelessness for the entire community. So because today's conversation is about solutions, I'd like to explore the three themes of searching out solutions. The first theme of searching out solutions is creating comprehensive and seamless systems of care. So instead of discrete groups of people or programs asking, should we accept this person into our program or into our community, there needs to be a way as a system to ask, of all of the options available, which housing and service strategy is best for each individual and family based on their need. So as you think about your system here, you can ask yourself, when you look at the data, are the systems and the strategies you're using to address homelessness reducing the number of people experiencing homelessness? If not, this indicates a need to change course, which isn't easy, but if we're going to end homelessness, we've got to embrace change and really think as a system. So you should also be asking as a community if resources are truly targeted effectively to those with the greatest needs, including people who are unsheltered. What types of outreach and engagement exists, and how is it tied to housing resources? And lastly, as you plan together, consider if your system has the right balance of interventions. Do you have enough permanent housing? Do you have enough rapid rehousing in order to respond to local needs? And if not, your funding priorities should really shift to be filling those gaps. The second theme of searching out solutions is collaboration among law enforcement, behavioral health, and social service providers. And collaboration is a word that we hear a lot. So I like to ask if there's a if your collaboration looks like a passive agreement to agree to disagree, or if there's a high level of engaged planning by multiple stakeholders. And what this means is, do people in the collaboration have a shared goal to quickly exit people from homelessness and to permanent housing? And is there a shared process to really match the right size intervention with the right family or individual? Do you have a commitment to data-driven results, coordinating with mainstream services, targeting your resources, adopting housing-first practices, and finding smart ways to use new or redirected investments to increase your capacity and quickly connect people to permanent housing? So I want to pause and highlight housing first. This is an important principle that can help drive decision-making towards housing and away from criminalization by meeting people where they are at and quickly connecting them to what they need most, which is housing. I brought along a Housing First checklist with me. It's in the handouts, and you can evaluate how Housing First is applied here in Key West. It's important to know that Housing First is not just a program, but really it's a system approach. The third and last theme in searching out solutions is alternative justice system strategies, and that we'll hear more about that today. Homelessness makes it more likely to get charged with a crime, and less likely that someone can actually deal with the fines or charges. So quite simply, it creates a negative feedback loop, and we need to figure out how to break this chain. I think the key is to looking at how we start to tease apart health issues versus criminal issues. Substance abuse and mental illness are health issues, but the behaviors are often criminalized, and people are jailed instead of receiving much-needed treatment. Punishing people with limited access to much-needed resources like housing will not lead to positive outcomes. So over the course of today's session, you'll hear about alternatives that can really help people move beyond the marginalization and isolation of the system to access the support they need. And I hope you'll really carry the conversation beyond this room so you can figure out how those approaches might fit in Key West, or how what you're doing here really matches with what you're hearing. So when it comes down to it, as I said earlier, communities are the ones that have the powers to make the change and have effective solutions. Currently in Key West and in Florida as a whole, there's much more that can be done to move away from criminalization and towards real solutions. You have another handout that talks about some statistics that sort of highlights how your community and other communities in Florida have been actually nationally recognized as having criminalization policies that negatively impact people, and concurrently, there's high numbers of crime and violence against people experiencing homelessness. So I'm probably not saying anything that is surprising, but I bring this up because what this information says to me is that this is a real chance to turn things around. It's a time to challenge your old assumptions and think about what we can do new, because the old ways just aren't working. And I'd like to challenge you to orient your thinking and your response towards permanent housing and take advantage of evidence-based practices and tools available, particularly Housing First. And certainly this isn't easy, but we are seeing some incredible successes when communities are able to change the way they do business and focus on housing. So before I close, I'd like to give you two real-world examples of constructive approaches. The first is the Downtown Emergency Services Center in Seattle, Washington. It's located in a very accessible place for people to be able to connect with, and it also has outreach workers that can go farther out and connect with people and bring them services to where they're at. And what's really great about it is that it has access to a lot of different types of housing and support services that people need. So when they ask for support, there's a clear and easy way to connect them. And it also has an interesting feature in that people are screened into the system, not out of the system. So their whole goal is to figure out how to connect people to the services. And they have a shared assessment so that they're really able to understand what people's specific housing needs are. And the other example I want to give is Project Home in Philadelphia, and that's not just because that's my home where I live and work out of. What's really interesting and exciting about Project Home is that they have a really unique way of coordinating their outreach teams. First of all, they access 24 hours a day, and they make themselves available to community members, service providers, anyone that might want to know what they're doing and how to connect with them. And they partner specifically with law enforcement, the VA Medical Center, and service providers, so they actually have teams that reflect different areas of expertise when they go out and connect with individuals experiencing homelessness. And they actually know people by name. So they take the time to get to connect with people who are experiencing homelessness. And they have regular meetings with service providers and housing teams so that they can really develop a shared plan to connect people to housing as quickly as possible. And they have access to housing resources so that that's very possible. So you'll hear more examples today, and we'll have a chance to talk about them. And as you want to learn more over the course of the next couple weeks, USICH will be here to offer you more details. Before I close, I want to highlight a particularly helpful report called In the Public Eye by Lucy Adams. This report uses examples from across the U.S. and actually across the world to guide readers and to understand in-depth policies about criminalization, but it also offers unique ways to think about how we could be more productive in addressing homelessness. So of particular interest to you, you may want to check out the checklist for designing, implementing, and evaluating approaches to dealing with homelessness and regulation of public spaces, which I provided to you in a handout. And I'd like to end by thanking you again for the opportunity to be here. USICH is a willing and able partner to help you. We are committed to Key West as you seek alternatives to criminalization. So I welcome you to join our newsletter and stay tuned to what we're doing and check out our website. And I'm not saying this as a self-promotion. I actually use the website as a resource every day. We have a human rights and alternatives to criminalization landing page, as well as other toolkits. So thank you. Together, we can end homelessness by implementing real, evidence-based solutions.
Thank you, Amy.
I'm sorry for interrupting, but a number of people are starting to request index cards to write down questions. So if you would like one of the ushers with the cards to come to you with a clipboard and an index card and pen, please just raise your hand and they'll come, and we'll start collecting those and bringing them forward. Thank you.
So, panel, any comments or questions that you have for Amy? What she said.
I have a question. You mentioned rapid rehousing. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what that is?
Sure. Rapid rehousing is a really great approach for people that don't need permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing is an ongoing subsidy, as well as some pretty intensive support services that can help people maintain that housing. But in many instances, you may have a family or individual who needs a boost of support in order to get back into housing, and then they're going to be good and go. And so rapid rehousing can be up as short as 3 months, can be as long as 18 months. And a lot of times it includes some type of rental assistance, as well as supports to outreach to landlords and to connect to housing.
Angie.
What you say just sounds so logical and simplistic that it's amazing. And I guess one of the things I think communities struggle with is the resources that are needed. Are there resources available from the federal government or elsewhere to help with homeless solutions?
Absolutely, and probably many of you know of the Continuum-of-Care. That's a federal resource directed specifically to homelessness and supporting homeless programs. But the other thing I mentioned is mainstream resources. So when you think about people experiencing homelessness or a housing crisis, a lot of times they touch a lot of our other systems, child welfare, health care. And so thinking about if people are already interacting with these systems, how can they be leveraged to better support the person and make sure that they're being stabilized in their housing?
Any other comments or questions here?
Yes, you also mentioned person-centered solutions. Can you elaborate more on that? Does that mean that there should be some type of panel or commission that, comprised of all stakeholders, or what?
Yeah, I mean, I think it always looks a little bit different in each community, but the core of person-centered planning and person-centered discussion is that you really, first of all, ask and truly want to hear from the experience of people experiencing homelessness, and that you include that in the process, and not just from people experiencing homelessness, but of providers, of everyone, to really think about what is it that people need and what experience do they inherently have that they can bring to the process that will really take root and make it effective.
Thank you all, and we're moving on. Kirsten.
Good morning, everyone. We've all heard the expression, you can never know a man until you walk a mile in his shoes. And I'm not going to ask you to do that this morning, but what I would like for you to take a moment to think about is what it's like to walk a mile in your own shoes. Specifically, I want you to think about this morning before 10:30, where you laid your head last night. and what you did when you first woke up. What are the sorts of activities did you do? Did you take a shower, stretch a little bit, have a cup of coffee, use the restroom, sit down in a chair anywhere? How did you get here? Does the no trespass sign downstairs apply to you, or are you an invited guest? And all of those things that you did this morning, if you were homeless, are crimes in many communities across the state and across the country. And I think it's very hard for someone like myself, who has never wondered where I'm going to lay my head at night, to really understand what that means and what the day-to-day consequences of that are. And I first began working in homelessness in the beginning of 2007. And I really did not have a clue what it means to be homeless and what the experience of that is like. And I certainly don't pretend to know everything, because I have not experienced it personally. But when I was first working in homelessness, I was very fortunate to connect to some advocates, including someone who is currently homeless. And I was doing outreach in St. Petersburg. At the time, they had quite a large population of homeless people sleeping on the streets. And he told me, he said, you can't just talk to people during the day in the park. You can't bring them to your office. He said, you have to come out here at 5 o'clock in the morning and see what it's like when people are waking up on the streets. And I said, really, 5 o'clock in the morning? Is that how early I need to get up? I'm kind of a 9 to 5 girl, you know? And he was like, yes, you have to get there before they get cleared out, because they have to leave, before sunrise, because there's a law, that prohibits that, sleeping, after sunrise. And so I said, okay, all right, 5 o'clock. And I couldn't even, I just rolled out of bed at 4:55 and, got into my car and drove the 2 blocks. And I got there all kind of bleary-eyed, and everyone's waking up because they have to move along. They weren't allowed to stay there. And there were about 80 people sleeping right in front of City Hall, which was part protest, part it was safe to sleep in numbers. And I started just talking to people, because they're all waking up, and the only thing anyone was talking about was when the bathroom's open. And we're all standing there, and they're like, gosh, the bathrooms don't open to 8. When, that's 3 hours away. When are the bathrooms going to open? No businesses are open. We couldn't go in there anyway, but when are the bathrooms going to open? And finally, one man just said, well, I'm going, and he, went to go into an alleyway. He's like, nature's calling. And there's a woman who's standing in front of me, and she said, well, nature's calling me too, but I'm telling her to wait. And I was stunned, honestly, because I had never considered what it was like to not have a bathroom accessible to me when I needed to use one. It's certainly nothing I would have ever thought about as an issue sitting in my office. And what happened that day is I really started to understand what it is like to have your daily existence shaped by these laws that regulate where you're allowed to be, where you're allowed to sit, where you're allowed to stand, where you're allowed to sleep, where you're allowed to even physically exist. And St. Petersburg in particular has a very complex patchwork of laws, a lot of which are specifically targeted at homeless people, which is one way that criminalization measures arise. Those are the measures that directly prohibit things like sleeping, camping. Pensacola has one about improper use of bathrooms. And that's really targeted at people who might want to wash up in the bathroom, or get water from a faucet, those types of things. And so it's really the regulation of private behavior that, when it's conducted in private places like our homes, is not a crime. It's in fact basic human needs that we all experience and we all take care of on a daily basis without much thought. That's why we're allowed to succeed and do so many other things, because we're focused not on where we're going to eat, where we're going to sleep, where we're going to sit, where we're going to use the bathroom, those types of things. We're focused on other things. And unfortunately, this is a trend really across the country, and I've watched a lot of city commission meetings, county commission meetings across the state of Florida to look at what the public debate is around these ordinances and why these ordinances are passing in communities. And it's so interesting to look at it from a statewide perspective, because we are having the same conversations in different cities and counties, and we're not talking to each other really about this issue. And what tends to happen, and I'm sure it's happened here, is that people come to the city or the county commission meetings, or they email their representatives and they say, homelessness is out of control. There are too many people begging. They're disturbing the tourists. My business is being affected because people are sleeping in the alleyway. People are urinating, behind my business. There's a lot of concerns that we have about the visibility of homelessness. What's this going to do to our economy? What's this going to do to tourism? We're afraid to go to certain areas of the town because of homelessness. And the immediate reaction, it's just natural. We want an immediate response and something to happen right away. And so inevitably somebody will say, well, what if we just pass an ordinance? We can address this problem that way. And fill in the blank of what kind of ordinance it is. Let's restrict begging. Let's restrict sleeping. Let's restrict camping. Let's restrict lodging in vehicles. And if we just pass one more ordinance, then we can send law enforcement out, and they can clear the streets, and we will have solved this issue. Or at the very least, we will have reduced the visibility of homelessness in our community. And people will think that we're doing something about this issue. But the reality is that what we're doing when we criminalize homelessness, and I've watched many of these commission meetings, and we never talk about what this costs us as a community. And I think it's really fiscally irresponsible to talk about passing ordinances that target homeless people for behavior and conduct that they have no choice but to conduct in public when they have no alternatives, and not talk about what that costs. And there's some very concrete direct costs that are talked about in the point in time count here locally, just in terms of what it costs to have people in the jail, what the hospitalization costs are. But a lot of times those cost studies do not take into account how much it costs for the courts, the public defender's offices, the state attorneys, the judges, these clogged criminal dockets, all of those costs that flow from treating homelessness as a criminal justice problem and not as a social and health problem. And there is a tremendous amount of research, a lot of it's on the U.S. Interagency for Counsel on Homelessness's website, about cost studies. There's been a lot of research about this over the years, and the literature universally agrees that criminalization is one of the most costly interventions to homelessness, and there is no study that suggests that it's effective. And in fact, there was a study from Berkeley when they were passing a sit-lie ordinance, where they were talking about, they were studying whether or not it was an effective solution to homelessness. And the study found that it had no impact, these sit-lie ordinances had no impact on boosting the economy in the local community, that there was no empirical evidence as to that. They impose tremendous fiscal costs on the community. And most significantly, they don't serve to connect people to services in their community, because these ordinances are passed without a corresponding increase in the stock of available services and options to people. So you have a situation where the only option becomes going to jail and cycling between jail and the streets. And one of the things that that study found, and a lot of studies have suggested this, is that it makes it even harder for people to escape homelessness. So when we're talking about costs, I want to be clear about something. Doing nothing about homelessness costs the community money in all kinds of hidden ways. Criminalizing homelessness costs you the most money. Actually putting people into housing and doing these solutions that Amy just discussed saves communities a tremendous amount of money. And when I say saves communities money, I'm not talking about dollars and cents. I'm talking about millions of dollars. There was a study in Central Florida just recently. In Central Florida, we're talking about Osceola, Seminole, Orange County, has the highest number of chronically homeless individuals for communities of like size in the entire country. And they hired a consultant from Creative Housing Solutions to do a study about the cost of long-term homelessness in Central Florida. It's a fascinating study. It's available online at Rethink Homelessness. And I very highly recommend it because it goes into depth how much money they're spending, and they quantify just the jail costs and the hospital costs. And then the study lays out a plan for increasing the stock of affordable housing and how much that would cost and how much it costs to keep people in permanent supportive housing, people who need services to maintain their housing. And they project that the counties collectively will save hundreds of millions of dollars over 10 years by doing this, that it will boost the economy in a variety of ways that they quantify. It's really astounding, and it lays out a roadmap for how Orlando and the surrounding areas can do that in their community. So that's costs. And I want to talk a little bit more about some of the legal issues, and I'm not going to get into a long legal dissertation. The National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty has a terrific report that comes out every year about criminalization of homelessness, and they kind of detail some of the legal problems about homelessness. And we're going to hear about Pottinger versus the City of Miami, so we're going to kind of get in the weeds on some of these legal theories. But basically, I spend most of my time litigating ordinances that criminalize homelessness. And I'm a constitutional lawyer who represents homeless people. And the reason for that is that these ordinances can violate the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Eighth Amendment, the 14th Amendment. And we talk about the 14th Amendment, we're talking about due process, we're talking about equal protection. Every kind of it's a great way to become a constitutional lawyer, because every kind of constitutional claim you can imagine comes up in the context of representing homeless people. And so one of the hidden costs with passing ordinances is if we pass an ordinance that is constitutionally deficient, someone like me might come along and sue over that, representing someone for their violations. And cities and counties have to pay our attorney's fees when we win. And, plus they have the cost of defense. And I'll tell you that, I look at ordinances regularly and I'm like, that's unconstitutional, that's unconstitutional. I could have 100 lawyers across the state just challenging all of the unconstitutional ordinances that are on the books. Fortunately, for probably a lot of cities across the state, I don't have 100 lawyers who can be challenging all of these ordinances. But that doesn't mean you couldn't win the lottery and happen to be one of the lucky few. I think that's something to consider. And I think a lot of times cities look at other cities. I think, city attorneys have this municipal listserv where they're like, oh, pass this sleeping ordinance, or here's trespass in public places. This is a fun way to deal with homelessness. And, there's not a whole heck of a lot of thought that goes into passing these laws. But aside from some of the legal problems, what's been very interesting to me across the state is that the sheriffs in particular, and your sheriff just this week came out and was talking about how much money it costs to have homeless people in the jail. And sheriffs across the state actually have been testifying at commission meetings saying, this is not how we should be approaching homelessness. The Orange County Sheriff, during debate over passing the sleeping camping ordinance, used to be the sheriff or the police chief in Orlando and was the one enforcing that ordinance there. And he testified, what are you doing? This is no silver bullet for ending homelessness. We should not be doing this. In Palm Beach County, when they were talking about passing a begging ordinance in 2010, Sheriff Rick Bradshaw said, we know we cannot arrest our way out of this situation because all the people we take off the street corner are merely passing through the system and are back out on the street, and they are not getting the help that they need. And I think that's the critical point that we're talking about here, is that when we're talking about criminalization, we're shifting the conversation away from what is it that people need to truly solve their problem. One other thing I want to mention is that not only are we, impacting ourselves in all kinds of ways, but we're also making it more difficult for people to escape homelessness. There is a tremendous amount of, when you get convicted of a crime, even a misdemeanor ordinance, there's a tremendous amount of court costs, fines, fees that get assessed against you. Some communities bill you for every night that you spend in their jail. So the longer your jail sentence is, the more court costs and fees you get. I had someone in Marion County who was arrested for begging, for asking for spare change, spent a significant time in jail, and when he got out, he owed nearly $3,000 in court costs and fines for that one episode of incarceration. And he was no closer to fixing the reason that led him to stand on a street corner and ask for money in the first place. Having a criminal record means that you're less likely to get access to employment, to housing, to public benefits. And, sometimes I talk to homeless people and they'll say something like, Kirsten, I promise I won't get arrested. And I said, don't make promises you can't keep, because we both know that there's nothing that you're going to do throughout the day that's not a crime, just because you're out here. And certain communities have regulated every aspect of being in public space. And that also is disrupting. I've had clients who have missed job interviews, who were close to getting out of homelessness, and then they get an arrest, and it totally disrupts and resets everything. They've lost their bed at a shelter. All kinds of negative impacts that can flow from this interaction with the criminal justice system. The other thing, Amy touched on this briefly, but I would like to also mention that there's a significant amount of activity at the United Nations around issues and attention around issues of homelessness and criminalization in our communities. And there's a few handouts about that in the materials that I provided, so I'm not going to really get into that into depth. But one thing I want to talk about very briefly is that I know Key West is a great place to be, and I'm sure probably everyone in this room thinks it's the best place in the world to live. But I will tell you that every community in Florida thinks that too. I was just in St. Johns County a couple weeks ago, and at a homelessness forum, and the whole time everyone was talking about, of course people are homeless in our community. It's the best place in the world to live. We love St. Johns County. Who wouldn't want to live here? And so people are not homeless in your community because you're Key West. They're homeless in your community because there are homeless people in every community. There's poverty in every community. And the other point that I wanted to make is that tourism, that's something else that comes up a lot. We have to do something about homelessness because of tourism. I agree, but it matters how you deal with the issue. And here's why. When I was in St. Johns County, the head of the Chamber of Commerce there was speaking about the impact of homelessness on business. And what she said is that it matters how we deal with homelessness because consumers, particularly millennials, which is a very large consumer population in the consumer world now. They make decisions about where they spend their money based on the social responsibility of businesses. And businesses who have paid attention to that have had the most profits over the last 10 years. And more than 80% of millennials will switch a brand because of social reasons, because they want to support a cause. And there's a growing trend in people being very interested in the social responsibility of communities where they travel, and as long as the environmental. And you don't want to be known for the city that arrests, church ladies for serving stew, or as Pensacola gained national renown for taking homeless people's blankets during the coldest winter we've had in years. So thank you very much for having me today, and I look forward to hearing from you all later.
Panelists, questions or comments?
You mentioned the costs, the higher cost of criminalizing versus the lower costs, I think, or even you put it, savings involved in alternatives. Do you know if anything has been done here in South Florida? Is the Central Florida study the groundbreaking study? Or do you know what equivalent costs there might be here?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't seen any study that's quite as comprehensive as the one out of Central Florida. I think that was a terrific study, and I hope that gets replicated in other communities. But here in Monroe County, there have been some cost studies that I'm aware of, and I put some of that in the flyer or the handout that I had. One of them was actually when you did your 10-year plan to end homelessness back in 2004. And I put those statistics that I had pulled out of the 10-year plan to end homelessness. And back then, you found that 418 homeless individuals were arrested in Monroe County for a total of 966 bookings. And that was calculated to cost the community $2.2 million for the year. And that did not include police time, prosecution, defense, probation, parole, healthcare needs while in custody. And then just this week, your sheriff, Rick Ramsey, reported that his office spends approximately $2 million per year. So in 10 years, we haven't changed that number. That, if you think about that, over 10 years, that's $20 million incarcerating homeless people. What could we do with $20 million in this community that would actually solve the problem? And I think that's something that's really helpful. And then there's numbers from the point in time count that I also included and are also in the flyer that was submitted here.
Yes.
Given the high incidence of chronic homelessness in Central Florida, have those communities come upon any unique or particularly effective solutions to address those, really significant problems there?
Well, I think what's really significant about this report from Central Florida is that there's a recognition that the most effective intervention for chronic homelessness is permanent supportive housing. And the reason we're talking about supportive housing is that there's a reason people are chronically homeless. And usually there are longstanding mental health issues. A lot of our chronically homeless are unfortunately veterans. I have personally spoken with veterans who have been homeless basically on and off since the Vietnam era. It's really depressing and astounding. I've met Iraq War veterans who have been sleeping on our streets, and I'm really glad that the federal government has paid attention to veteran homelessness tremendously. But the reason it's permanent housing, but then you have services that wrap around, so it helps the person maintain that housing. And in Central Florida, that's it. That is what their focus is, and they have this plan. And they looked at it, even if we just reduce 25% of chronic homelessness, how much do we save? and then the whole range up into 100%. But even at 25%, they're still talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of saving, just by focusing on permanent supportive housing.
Anything else? Then Benji, bring us up to date from the legal side.
My orientation to homelessness came through my involvement as a volunteer with the ACLU in a class action lawsuit we filed against the city of Miami in 1988. And it was a crisis then that led us to bring the lawsuit on behalf of thousands of homeless people that populated the streets and the geographic region of Miami. But these were real people too, and one of the things that I did and my colleagues did that was just so enlightening is we spent a lot of time on the streets talking with homeless people, and it was the first time I had done that. And what you discover is that homeless people are really no different than us. They're siblings, they're parents, they're children, they're people who had dreams like us that were dashed for a number of different reasons that confront us in our daily lives, whether it was the loss of a job at a particularly bad time, a catastrophic illness that was uninsured, a divorce, a change in circumstances that kind of mushroomed into a loss of your financial stability. And I think once we recognize that these people are people no different than us, it provides us a certain perspective that you need to have. One of the things that I think is significant about the Pottinger case is that it kind of exemplifies what Amy and Kirsten have been talking about the expense. And what I see is just a dramatic waste of resources. I think there was a lot of good that came out of Pottinger. I think we established certain fundamental rights that need to be observed at just the very baseline for homeless people. But over a period initially of about 15 years, which is how long the litigation took, there were, as I think about it, there were really dozens of people like myself that spent hours and hours dedicated to this litigation and this adversarial fighting about what do we do about homeless people and what are their rights and where does the interest of the city to provide for its citizens and constituents take over. And if you put together all of the time and all of the energy that was dedicated to this, and like Kirsten says, if we were to have rededicated those resources and those finances to providing some real solutions for homeless people, we might be in a completely different place than we are today. One of the things that I think is kind of awful is that while we spent this time doing this litigation, I see things repeating themselves, not only in our community, but in other communities. And the notion, for instance, of criminalizing homelessness, which was what our lawsuit is based on, is going on all over the country and all over Florida, and it has been demonstrated, as the previous speakers have said, to be expensive and ultimately ineffective. I think that the criminalization of homelessness is an act of frustration. It's something that we resort to because we believe it's going to be a quick fix to this problem, and I suppose public officials have constituents that complain, and it seems to be something that we can do. But what I learned from my own life is that the things that I do out of frustration are generally bad solutions and ineffective. I think of my parenting decisions that I've made with my children out of frustration, and those were among the worst I've ever made. So I've learned in my personal life to step back and to try not to be reactive, not to take action based on fear or based on facts that I may not know enough about. And I think that applying that kind of a strategy to redressing homelessness, which I think we all want to do, because this is our community, and these are members of our community, whether they were born here, whether they moved here, however they came here, they are part of our community. And I think that's the way we need to look to better solutions to address homelessness. So the Pottinger litigation, like I said, began in 1988 when there were huge numbers of homeless people on the street, and they were being targeted by the city of Miami and harassed for the purpose of essentially rendering them invisible, to try to chase them out of the city. And this was evidenced by the language that city officials used, the strategies that police used. And we filed a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit, and we filed and requested immediate injunctive relief because homeless people were being targeted at that moment. People's belongings were being taken and destroyed. And basically the problem was that there was inadequate shelter. There simply was no place for people to go. They didn't have the resources for all of these different reasons to get their own shelter, and the city and government agencies that hopefully should have provided that safety net had not. And so that was the crisis that existed in 1988. And so we seized upon a number of, our focus was not, we weren't social workers, we were concerned, like Kirsten, about constitutional rights. And so we tried to identify different constitutional rights that captured what was being done to these people. And one of the constitutional rights is the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. And that arises a lot in, we think of death penalty litigation and the way that the death penalty is carried out. But what it also does is it prevents the criminalization of status. And we looked at a couple of old U.S. Supreme Court cases that really formed the foundation for our approach to this litigation and really talks about what this is about today. One of those cases was a case called Powell, and it was a case where the municipality had criminalized drug addiction, so the actual status of being a drug addict. And the court said, you know, you can no more criminalize status, being a drug addict, then you can criminalize being a leper or having some kind of disease that you have no control over. And there was a subsequent case called Robinson where the criminalization was of drinking in public. And it was concerned an alcoholic person, and the question that arose in the case, or the distinction that was made, was, well, this person, we're talking about conduct, we're really not talking about status, and therefore maybe it's okay to do that. But in some of the opinions, they said, well, if you were to be able to show that an alcoholic, which is a disease and a person who has to drink, if that person were homeless and had no alternative but to engage in that conduct in public, then that kind of matches up the conduct with their status, and that would be prohibited. And that's the approach that we used, and we attempted and successfully showed that homeless people, by and large, do not choose to be homeless. for all of the different descriptions of how we are able to live in our homes and all of the difficulties that a homeless person faces each and every day of their life, to do the simplest, most basic things that we take for granted: finding a bathroom, finding drinking water, finding a place to sit down, finding food. Those people and the district court in our case, based on the evidence that was provided, found that by and large, homeless people are homeless involuntarily and not because they choose to do so or to be so. And that was a big controversy that I think a lot of communities have, is, are these people choosing to be this way, and or is this something that they have no choice in? And one of the things that I've found in talking to homeless people is sometimes people will say, yeah, I choose to be this way. This is what I want to do. And as I talk further with them, the conclusion that I come to is that a lot of times, because homeless people have so little control of the various elements in their life, that they'll put on a face that this is a choice that they've made because it may be one of the only choices that they can make. And so they're going to want to say that, no, this isn't a result of these other factors I have no control over. This is something I choose, but it's not necessarily the truth. One of our theories was that there was a violation of due process. And again, this has to do with the fact that people were being arrested for doing little more than harmless activities that were vital to their living, their very existence. So this came down to sleeping in public, eating in public, sitting in public, again, doing the things that we all do for granted and we do all the time and take for granted in our homes, that these people have to do in public. And between the basic harmlessness of those activities and the involuntary nature of their condition, those two things together made out a claim of due process. We brought a claim for equal protection, which requires either demonstrating that a person is a member of a suspect class, some type of characteristic that can't be erased, that they have no choice to be a part of. Well, the court found that being impoverished and homeless was not necessarily a suspect class, but found that there was a violation of the fundamental right to travel. And the court said that, well, what the city is doing is they're forcing people, homeless people, by these arrest and criminalization strategies to move from one place to another, and that violates a fundamental constitutional right. And in order to do that, you have to have a very significant, important, a compelling state or governmental interest. And the court went through all of the different interests that the city advanced to justify what was a clear strategy, and said that none of them really reached that level of a compelling interest, not just something that was a passing interest or a rational interest, to justify the violation of all these people's constitutional rights. Another significant issue was property. People have their stuff. They have to have their stuff somewhere. And this is a big issue and became a very central focus of the litigation in Miami, because where homeless people slept and existed, they had their belongings. And there was no question that the things that we saw in the areas where homeless people were their belongings, because, and the court found that typically people would keep their belongings neat, together, packaged, sometimes not, because sometimes they can't, but it was clear that the property that police and city officials were taking indiscriminately and burning and destroying in so many offensive ways was clearly the property of homeless people, and it was their vital belongings. It was the identification that they vitally needed to get medical care, to get a job, to access social services and other things. It was their personal belongings. It was their medication that they needed to simply stay healthy on the street in those difficult circumstances. And the court found that people did have a reasonable expectation of privacy in their property. And the law is interesting in that way because it does provide the same protection for something that's carried in a locked briefcase as it does to something that's carried in a paper bag, because we don't want to make those distinctions. And so the court found that the property of homeless people was protected and that the city did not have a sufficient compelling interest in public safety or keeping its streets clean and neat to override that those interests. So what the litigation was, and it went on for about 15 years. And like I said, it wasn't just me. There were literally dozens of people. So there was a team of ACLU lawyers. There were experts that came and testified in court. There were court resources that were dedicated, the judge, the clerks, the administrators, all of the people that had to service this lawsuit. And on the city side, there were city attorneys. They ultimately had to engage private law firms to help with this representation. There were law enforcement officers, there were fire officials, there were all of these resources that were occupied doing this litigation for at least the first 15 years. And there was a trial. We had a trial that lasted 5 days. And some of the testimony that came out of the trial that the judge accepted are really quite poignant and significant. One of the experts talked about the fact that homeless individuals, and I'm reading from this decision, and it's really a very amazing decision and really gives light to exactly what the rights are that people have that people should really look at. It's United States versus Pottinger. You can get to it on the internet, and it's something that deserves a read if you're concerned with homeless people and their rights. So it says that homeless individuals are profoundly poor, have high levels of mental or physical disability, live in social isolation. They rarely, if ever, choose to be homeless. People become homeless as a result of a financial crisis or because of a mental or physical illness. We had an expert, a medical doctor, who testified about the medical conditions that are caused by homelessness or are exacerbated by homelessness. It says, the opinion says, for example, hypertension, gastrointestinal disorders, tuberculosis, peripheral vascular disease occur at a much higher rate in homeless people due to exposure to the elements, constant walking, sleeping and eating in unsanitary conditions, lack of sleep, poor nutrition. Persons have no place to store their medication. These are all of the conditions that homeless people suffer that make them so vulnerable and that prevent them, when you've got to grapple with all of those things, from dealing with the other primary issue, which is simply not having shelter, not having a place to be. At the end of our litigation, we went through a trial. There was a 5-day trial. Then there was an appeal. The city lost the case. The city appealed to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal court that governs our jurisdiction. And the court, ultimately the city said, we've changed now. This may have been how things were in 1988 and up to 1992 when we had our trial, but things have changed. So the court, after full briefing, which is a big deal, it's filing hundreds of pages of documents both on our side and their side, sent it back down to the trial court judge and said, have a hearing on how things have changed. And the city came in, and things had changed somewhat. There was now a program in effect to begin to assist homeless people. I think there was now the food and beverage tax had been begun, which raised a dedicated source of money to help homeless people. But ultimately, the judge, after hearing all of the evidence, decided that, you know what, there still remain involuntarily homeless people on the street, and whether it's thousands or hundreds or only dozens, if those people still have no place to go, you can't arrest them for doing these most basic things. So there was another appeal that resulted from that, back up to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, more briefing, and the court said, we don't know, the way you need to resolve this is through mediation. And we went through 20 months of mediation. So these were meetings with a mediator, with 20 people at times in the same room, trying to tease apart these issues and come upon some solution that was going to protect the rights of all of these people. And ultimately, we arrived at a settlement agreement. And if anyone knows anything about mediation and settlement agreements, both sides left unhappy about what had happened. So we didn't get exactly what we wanted. The city didn't get what it wanted, but this was going to be this was going to be the protocol that we were going to live under and deal with for the next many years. And what happened is, some 15 years later, in 2013, the city moved in court to revisit this settlement agreement. And they now wanted to roll back these protections that we believe had at least, again, most minimally protected the rights of our clients. And ultimately, this led to another year of litigation. And ultimately, there was a mediated settlement. Things pretty much stayed the same. There were some changes, some adjustments, but our hope, the plaintiff's lawyer's hope, is that today, hopefully, we won't be relying on this kind of baseline protection of constitutional rights, because there are real efforts and real solutions that are empirically proven, housing first, and different approaches that we hope will actually make a significant dent in homelessness before we have to go through this all again. I wasn't able to see the sign. Am I like way over?
You're just at the right point.
Okay, well, anyways, that's a little bit about the litigation, and I don't think it's the right way to go. I think it's a waste of resources that could be much better used and dedicated to finding real solutions for homeless people in communities like Key West.
Thank you, Benji. And again, any comments or questions from the panel for Benji?
I have a question. Can you be more specific about some of the things that the city of Miami was proposing when it was trying to modify the settlement agreement recently, like about, like as it relates to property and some of the other stuff that they wanted to do?
Well, some of the things they were trying to do is basically eliminate the protection for properties. They wanted to, one of the things they wanted to do is say that if there was property that was in any place, whether it was recognizable as homeless person's property or not, if it was present for 24 hours, then they wanted to be able to destroy that property. There was a prohibition in the initial settlement against arresting people for being naked when they had to deal with going to the bathroom or bathing. And they wanted to And again, the greater problem, the more significant problem there was that there simply weren't public restrooms. There weren't places where people could shower, and that's the only reason. No one enjoys urinating or defecating in public. And so there was a proposal that the arrest that now was prohibited could be made as long as there was a bathroom, a public restroom, somewhere within a mile of where the arrest was to be made. And if you've ever had to try to walk a mile to find a restroom that may or may not be open, that may or may not be there, it's really not a good solution. So we saw them as really trying to gut the protections in this settlement, and we think that most of the protections still remain now.
Any other question? Yeah. To what extent is Pottinger, do you think, relevant here? I know that it happened in the Federal District Court in the Southern District of Florida. Is there a legal effect of the Pottinger settlement here, or is it precedential or influential?
I think it's influential. Key West is in the Southern District of Florida. I think that, again, it did lay out a baseline of rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution, and one of the things that we did do is ensure that that decision and that opinion would be left intact. And I think if this community, if those rights that were recognized in the Pottinger decision were violated in this community or other communities in the Southern District of Florida, that they would be found to be unconstitutional in the same way that Pottinger was.
Thank you again. David.
Okay, thank you. My talk will mainly just try to give you a perspective of life on the streets, and I hope to be able to debunk some of the myths surrounding homelessness, dispel some of the misconceptions that people often have as to who are homeless, why are they homeless, and why are they here in our community? Why is this homeless person here? I will tell you up front that I am homeless, that even though I have a law degree, that I had a perfect storm of some bizarre circumstances, a false arrest, an illegal eviction, and destruction of all my property, exacerbated by being laid off from my job, after a year and a few months of unemployment compensation ran out, I had very few, actually no alternatives. And that's frankly a common ground of, I think, everyone that you'll find is homeless, that they'll have a trauma, they'll have an emergency, they'll have something that hits them. But what's commonly shared is that there's a lack of family and social support that leads to homelessness. No one says, I just want to live out here because it's a wonderful place and I want to sleep underneath the stars. They do that because they don't have that family support. They don't have that social support. And they fall through the cracks. And I think most of you, if you lose 2 or 3 paychecks, you're not going to be homeless because you do have that support system. Let's also talk about words here, because words are important, and words define the framework for which you analyze a problem. Homelessness, a homeless person, is not a noun. It's more of an adjective. We're not a self-identified group of people. We're not so much a protected class. It's mainly just a person who simply does not have a home. And it's usually a transient type, not calling the homeless person themselves a transient, but it's usually a transient set of circumstances. Most people who experience homelessness do it only for a few months, and then they find some type of, and they bounce back, particularly people who are professionals. And I could also say that from my personal observation, I've seen professionals on the streets. I've seen people with MD degrees. And I have an individual in mind who had an MD degree who was homeless, who was sleeping on the street. Engineers I've seen homeless. doctors, lawyers, engineers. It so happens that because they do have that professional degree, they're able to bounce back quickly. They're able to seek other supportive services. But the point I wanted to emphasize here, or to share with you, is that it's not some type of unique circumstance. It's not some type of personal irresponsibility, some type of drug-addicted, mentally addled person, that this can literally happen to everyone, and that but for the grace of God go you. That this is something that I'm hoping to at least evoke some sense of empathy for people that are homeless. There is a difference between chronic and obviously situationally homeless. And I think probably much of the problem here, or much of the issues that you see here, happen with folks that you deem to be chronically homeless. And I think there are federal definitions, which Amy and Kirsten are probably more familiar with as to what a chronically homeless person is. But for the purposes of my talk right now, just someone that you see out there on the streets. But let's go into some of the situations and some of the myths and some of the circumstances that you see surrounding a homeless person. One of the myths, and I think Kirsten addressed that, are that people flock to tourist areas, like Key West, for instance, because it's such a wonderful place to be. And this is a wonderful place to be. I've been here a few times visiting, and I've enjoyed myself here. But as Kirsten commented on and observed and demonstrated, every place believes that they're a wonderful place to believe. And there's homeless people in every place. Do you think that restricting the charities that feed homeless persons, prohibiting them from feeding, somehow is going to solve the problem of homelessness or discourage people from coming here? No, absolutely not. What I call that is the feeding the pigeons rationale. Okay, you think that stop feeding the pigeons will lead to fewer pigeons. And yes, that's true. It should, because obviously pigeons will not have an alternative source of food. Will not feeding homeless people somehow lead to fewer homeless people, that they won't flock here? No. What it'll lead to is homeless people going through trash, getting more diseased or spoiled food. It'll lead to sickness. It'll lead to misery. It'll simply increase the misery. People do not come here because the food is great. They don't come here, they don't become homeless because it's wonderful and they can live the life of Riley. I can tell you from a personal observation, life on the streets is traumatic. It is emotionally traumatic. It is physically traumatic. Do you ever wonder why you see many homeless people sleeping during the day? That's because you cannot sleep at night. It is very difficult to sleep at night. You sleep with one eye open. You have a part of your brain always on alert, because you can open up an eye at 3 o'clock in the morning, you'll see a person standing right next to you, surveying, assessing, sizing you up, trying to figure out if there's something there that they can take. Okay? And so you never have a good night's sleep. Now, I'm sure that many of you have gone through periods of your time for some reason or another in which you've gone through sleep deprivation. And you know how it feels when you don't get a good night's sleep. Can you imagine how it feels not to have a good night's sleep for months on end? You're emotionally, mentally not there. You don't make good decisions. In fact, you're pretty grumpy in the morning, if not totally pissed off. These things have an effect on you emotionally, and they often result in violence against other people. Many fights happen in the mornings. I've seen many fights happen when homeless folks are getting together for morning meals, and the slightest insult, the slightest brushing up against somebody, can quickly escalate into physical violence. So I hope to, once again, dispel the myth that that people flock here because of the great food that they can get from being homeless, that they flock here because of the wonderful place it is. They come here for the very same reasons that you are here. They come here because this is a fairly decent place to live. The weather is good. The beach is nice. But they are going to be here, regardless of whether you're going to restrict the feeding, put the feeding someplace, isolate it and segregate it, and try to concentrate them all into one spot. And I believe that there's probably some constitutional issues involved in that, and Benji and our other constitutional lawyer may be better prepared to discuss some of the restrictions on freedom of liberty and freedom of movement, First Amendment issues that might be inherent in that. But these are all facile, superficial solutions to a fairly complex problem. Now, actually, the solution to the problem is direct, and it's you give a homeless person a home, okay? But you just don't do that just naked without the support services. I think, as Amy discussed, in her really excellent presentation on the Housing First program. But I think we believe that that is probably the best and most constructive solution to ending homelessness. Give them a home. Give them a case manager who is able to address the underlying causes of homelessness, who is able to provide global solutions to it, who is able to connect them both with health care, with legal, and with other services, with therapy services, in order to resolve that. Using words like sweeping homeless aside, sanitizing the area, putting them away from the tourists and from the hotels, all of these are motivated, obviously, by legitimate interest in protecting the image of your community and in terms of protecting your property values. No one wants a homeless person sleeping in front of their front door, in front of their business, scare off tourists, lower your values. But sweeping aside, and even using that term is somewhat offensive, as if they're rubbish, as if they're some type of trash, and that you can simply sweep and discard. But sweeping aside is not going to work. You really have to go through you really have to address the fundamental solution, the fundamental issues that led to homelessness in the first place. But again, that's a second step from from giving them a home and resolving the homelessness issue in the first place. Now, I'd like to give a couple of remarks about how I got into this. I am a named plaintiff, a class representative in the Pottinger class action lawsuit. I didn't come in at the beginning like Benji some 15 years ago. I came in as a result of the city's plans to revise the Pottinger agreement. I personally observed how police would routinely ignore many of the principles of the Pottinger agreement, and I think that the main beneficial effect of Pottinger, aside from establishing legal limitations on what the police can do in terms of arresting a person who is involuntarily homeless for performing life-sustaining activities, the main beneficial effect of Pottinger is more of a paradigm shift. I think it's to establish that homelessness is, to a large extent, an involuntary circumstance. My personal observations are no one chooses to be homeless. Everybody on the streets, with the exception of one person I know who does it for more religious or idealistic reasons, but everybody that I know, personally know, on the streets would prefer to have a roof over their heads, would prefer to have a home. And as I said, this has concrete and direct emotional and physical results. Now, I'm nearsighted, so I'm not going to be able to see the person.
I'll give you a wave. You got time. Keep
Okay,
going.
thank you. But my personal observations are that, as I said, the police would conduct routine sweeps and ignore Pottinger, nevertheless. And then when I saw that the city of Miami had advanced what I thought was fairly outrageous proposals to revise Pottinger, aside from what Benji mentioned in terms of their proposals to confiscate property after 24 hours and to arrest people for performing public or life-sustaining functions, such as going to the bathroom where no bathrooms are available. And if you imagine walking a mile to a bathroom when you have to go, a mile's a fairly long distance, especially if you're disabled. The city also proposed to force people into some type of shelters or force people into treatment and to arrest people if they refuse shelter, I think after 3 times within some 90-day period, I think it was. Which, again, is coming from a premise here that the homeless or person experiencing homelessness are some type of subhuman species that must be forced into some type of treatment. That they were somehow deprived of the regular constitutional rights of movement, of freedom, of liberty that is guaranteed to everyone else. And I think that is utterly, totally wrong and highly offensive and outrageous premise to be legislate, to enact a municipal ordinance. And I have to say, I'm impressed with this audience right now, and I wanted to preface my remarks with this. I think this is remarkable. I know that you've testified before city councils, but I'm not aware of too many other just public gatherings, even before something is on the table, where a community has come together with the ears open to listen to alternatives. And so this shows that this is an impressive community, and I mean that sincerely. And I'm hoping, again, that you can at least come away with this, from this, with a sense of empathy, with a sense of understanding that, as Benji noted, those quick, facile solutions to sweep people away, to segregate, to isolate, are not only inhumane, are not only costly, more costly, but utterly unconstitutional, and further, it really hurts your city in the long run. It affects really significant costs to your city. So that's the end of my remarks, and I thank you again for inviting us here.
Thank you, David. And any questions or comments from anybody on our panel up here for David?
I just have a comment. I wanted to comment about what you said about the feeding issues and whether or not it enables people. And I have a colleague who has formerly experienced homelessness, and that debate came up in his community. And he said, of course, feeding enables people. It enables people to live. It's gas in the tank. I mean, we all need that. And expecting someone to find a job and get out of homelessness without, this essential fuel that we all need is kind of a lot to ask. And the other point I wanted to make is that there was a recent case about food sharing restrictions out of Dallas, Texas, the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty brought. And they had an expert who testified in that case because one of the city's justifications for putting so many restrictions on food sharing is that it would force service-resistant homeless people to connect to services if they were restricting food. And what the expert testified to and the court accepted is that the city's interests in regulating feeding were based on speculations and assumptions. They produced no evidence to demonstrate that that was true, and that in fact The lack of food wouldn't cause people who are service resistant to seek those services, but instead they would get food in more unsafe manners, as David spoke about, such as from dumpsters or other locations.
I think saying that feeding a homeless person is enabling homelessness is sort of like saying that people get sick in order to get free health care. You know, I mean, that's you're stating the problem somewhat backwards here. You know, it's, as you said, feeding does enable life, but again, no one becomes homeless to get a free meal. It's not, homelessness is not the life of Riley. It's not a wonderful life where everything is free and you can live under the stars and just enjoy life. It is a highly traumatic experience. I can tell you that day in and day out. You're traumatized during the night, you know, through lack of security. You're traumatized during the day by people I'm targeting you, and actually something I didn't mention is the judgmental attitudes and the discrimination that's visited upon you, and these knock down your self-worth to such a point that you absorb much of this judgmental opinions yourself, and you feel and your self-worth and your self-esteem is lowered yourself. And again, that is what enables a cycle of homelessness, because once that is done, that restricts your choices and what you have available to you. As Benji said, that people then start to believe the hype, they believe the myth that they choose to be homeless. And that's what exacerbates and enables a cycle of homelessness. Now, once you give somebody a home, now they have a base. Now they can take a shower. Now they don't have that body odor. They don't have the smells. That's when they can actually go out and find a job, put on a suit, get some clean clothes. That's when they can resolve the issues that led to their homelessness.
Other comments or questions? Then we're going to give you each up here up to 2 minutes, big time amount. If you have any summation or final words you want to say before we move to questions. We'll start over here where we began.
Sure. I've really appreciated the chance to hear all of you and your expertise and your just willingness to bring your personal experiences and your professional experiences to bear here. And wanted to just share some exciting news with you. Many of you may have heard our president, as well as the VA and HUD, our partner agencies, make an announcement that we've since 2010, when Opening Doors, the federal plan to end homelessness, was released, we've decreased veteran homelessness by 33%. And yeah. And of those people, of those veterans who accessed housing, 40% of them were unsheltered. So we can do this when we have resources and we have a collective will and we target what we're doing, we can make a difference.
I would just like to say that I'm really happy to be here today, and I appreciate you all taking the time out to think about this issue. Homelessness, I think sometimes we do this issue a disservice when we talk about it in such broad strokes, because the experience of people is different. And the reasons why people are experiencing homelessness and what they need to get out of homelessness is very different. And I think one thing that we haven't touched on that I just wanted to mention is that, having shelter is not the same thing as having permanent housing. And I know that you have an emergency shelter here, COTS, in your community, but people have to leave there at a certain time in the morning. People can't get there until a certain time at night. They're not allowed to leave personal belongings there. And this is similar, this is kind of the model of emergency shelter across the country and all over Florida. But so even people who have a shelter at night, I know you have visibility of people and their belongings, and they're, moving around the public areas of your city. And there's also people who receive disability checks and public benefits, but it's not enough to cover housing, particularly in a place like Key West where, housing is very expensive. Disability is $600 and something a month. And I know a lot of people who they can stay in a cheap motel or something like that for a couple of weeks out of the month, but there's a spike in certain communities the last week of every month because people can't afford to be inside. And every homeless person I know who goes inside tries to take, 10 other people with them and, just like jam into the one room that they get because everyone wants to be inside. And, representing a person who doesn't have a home and being their lawyer sometimes feels like beside the point, because what I'd really like to do is just give them housing. And that's why I'm really happy to be here today to talk to you all about other solutions so I can tackle other issues and stop representing homeless people for criminalization issues.
Criminalization will not resolve homelessness. It's demonstrated to be excessively costly to communities and ultimately ineffective. It breeds litigation that would misdirect the valuable and limited resources of a community to bring real solutions. And the answer is to provide shelter and to provide homes, and that's what people need so that they can gain kind of a sense of stability and then begin to deal with the other issues that may have caused them to be homeless. And I think that's the direction this community is going, and I think it's great that all you people are here today to talk about this and to examine what this community is doing.
David?
Stigmatizing homelessness, I think, fails to recognize that we all share a common humanity. We're all human beings. We all have families, and many of us have children. I think next time you pass a homeless person, instead of pretending that they're invisible or smelly or undesirable, perhaps you can take a couple of minutes, just look them in the eye. Just look them in the eye. Okay? Really. Try to just for a minute. Connect, just for a minute. And maybe even ask them, how was their day? How are you? You don't necessarily have to give them any money or anything like that, but just try to connect. And I think maybe you are going to see that there's not that much of a difference. And as I said, words do matter. Words like bum, vagrant. These are all words that we use to dehumanize and make it much easier to deprive somebody of their civil rights. Once in civil rights deprived from one, our civil rights deprived from all. So, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you all. We've got some questions now for you. Yep, please.
Okay.
Your concerns seem to focus in a number of common areas. There's one, however, that just stands out as a matter of question of fact. Benji, has the court made a decision on the latest Pottinger case?
Well, the status is that we came to a mediated amendment of the previous settlement. So there was this settlement agreement in 1998, and it's now been amended, and it's been adopted by the court. And so by and large, the protocol that was in place from 15 years ago remains in place today.
Okay, good. Thank you. You have time for comments later, but otherwise we'll get into back and forth, and a bunch of other questions probably won't get dealt with. You'll be able to talk afterwards if you wish to. Here's one of the general areas, and there's a number of versions. This is one of them. The Florida Keys are unique. Our area provides a particularly attractive community especially the weather, the lifestyle, etc. We have a disproportionate supply of homeless people. If we provide housing for homeless, what's to keep more homeless people from moving here with the expectation of housing? When does the burden of the community become so great that the community has met its obligations? The residents of Key West are afraid if they give better housing that either more homeless will migrate here, which is somewhat related to the Key West is unique in the fact that the space is limited, both horizontal and vertical housing is limited. So how do you give more space to the homeless when there are those who are employed who themselves find it difficult to find housing? How can we provide housing to the homeless in the Keys when housing is at such a premium and so very limited to those who live and work, sometimes several jobs? You get the drift. Anyone want to respond to this one?
I'll start.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Ian.
I think there's two pieces to that. One is the strategy that you use to end homelessness. Is it going to create an imbalance with other communities so that people say, oh, I'm going to get better services if I go to Key West? And then the other piece is about affordable housing. So we're at a real precipice in our nation. We are seeing communities that are saying that they've effectively ended homelessness for populations in their community because they've been able to target resources. And what they're able to say is that because we've been effective at targeting our resources, we have a nimble and flexible system that can help people who are experiencing a housing crisis so that homelessness does not need to become a way of life. But what's more important is that it's just not that community operating in a bubble. They work at a regional and as well as statewide level so that there's a coordinated effort not just in that one community, but across the state and across their region, so that there really is some parity and some ability for people to work with their neighbors and community members who are experiencing a housing crisis. I think the other piece about affordable housing is well taken. There needs to be affordable housing in any community, and many, even big cities like New York City with high housing costs struggle. How do we make sure that there's affordable housing for people at all income levels, including people who have a fixed income at a very low rate? So I think you've heard one of the appeals is to think about how can you repurpose money that you're investing in maintaining homelessness into ending it. And I think considering how, as new development is created, how do you incorporate affordable housing into that new development? And I think really being firm as a community that, yeah, having affordable housing is important, and disallowing NIMBYism. It's not one neighborhood's problem or another. It's as a community, how are we going to ensure that there's affordable housing for people at all income levels so that we can continue to thrive as a community? So there's sort of some overall thoughts to get the conversation going.
Other responses?
I want to just respond to this idea that Key West is unique, and I certainly agree with that. I think every city and community in Florida is unique, just as every human being is unique. But I think that the idea of having limited real estate and land to develop is certainly different when the edges of your community are surrounded by water. There's clearly a limit, but that that comes up a lot, particularly on the west coast of Florida in areas like Pinellas County and things like that. That's pretty built up in terms of where you're going to put that, and affordable housing gets torn down and multi-million-dollar condos go up. And so, a lot of communities are struggling with these similar issues. And I think, talking about this idea about regional coordination and statewide coordination, I definitely think that that's my wish. I think if we could coordinate as much as we do on criminalizing homelessness, And I think that's why you see kind of a race to the bottom in Florida when we track these ordinances. You know, St. Petersburg passes a panhandling ordinance, and Clearwater says, well, we have to pass a panhandling ordinance, otherwise people are just going to come here. And then Tampa says, okay, well, we're going to pass a panhandling ordinance. And then Hillsborough County says, well, we need to pass a panhandling ordinance, otherwise people just come to the county. And, you know, it goes on down the chain, and nobody's really, you know, done anything to solve this issue. And, you know, one other thing I wanted to mention about Key West and some of the issues, we were very fortunate yesterday to be taken on a really nice tour of your community. We got to see, you know, the affordable housing units and, you know, cots and kind of get a lay of the land. And just in talking about these issues and some of the issues that your community is facing, it really struck me how similar the conversations here have been to what I have been hearing very recently out of St. Johns County, which is where St. Augustine is. It is a very high income community. And that's one of the things that they talked about, is that people who are just working regular jobs, people working 2 jobs, cannot afford housing in our community. What is it that we can, you know, possibly do to address this? And I feel like there would be some benefit to collaborating with other communities and thinking through these issues together, because the truth is that you know, I don't think it's productive to get into, well, why do homeless people get affordable housing but, you know, regular people don't get affordable housing? I mean, I think affordable housing is a basic necessity and a structural issue that impacts a lot of people. You know, there's no place in this entire country where someone making minimum wage can afford fair market rent. You know, that's a problem. And those are obviously more structural issues in our economy and how our housing sector is put up. But the bottom line about all of this and the talking about housing is that if you want to talk about real solutions, then let's talk about this, and let's talk about how to make this happen. But, you know, if you're fine with people sleeping on your streets, you know, then we don't have to talk about housing. You know, that's really, there's no in between. You know, there's either ending homelessness or not. So that's what I think.
I don't know the homeless population here, but I think that the fear of some kind of mass migration to Key West is just false. It's not. I don't think that it's going to happen. I think, in my experience, people tend to stay in places where they're familiar with the surroundings, where they know where they can get food, where they can use a bathroom, where they may have some family connection, where they've, you know, even kind of become a part of a homeless community. And I don't think that really people are going to just walk, hitchhike, use their last dollars on a bus to get to Key West.
Yeah, I'd also like to address this fear that homeless will flock to Key West if they have the promise of getting a free home. That's essentially what it is. It's a fear. It's emotion, but it's not informed by any type of empirical evidence, observations, or science. And I think, on the other hand, that there is science, that there is evidence that housing first works to resolve homelessness. That there are experiences, I believe, and Amy may be able to better explain this, that there are stats that show that housing first, which is to give a person a home, along with a case manager. It's not a free home, keys, you're here forever, okay? That they do connect people with services to address the underlying cause of homelessness. That this model is successful. It has a 95% success rate. That is the science. That is not emotion, and that is not unfounded fear. So I think social policy should be based upon empirical evidence and science, and not be predicated upon fears.
Thank you. There's a number of questions that really want some specific empirical guidelines. For example, keeping in mind that whatever resources allocated to solutions will necessarily be somewhat limited, and that moral and ethical considerations might well have us do more, has the federal government ever come up with a number or percentage of population we must shelter? Another version of that. What percentage of a city's budget is recommended to be spent on homelessness? Are there examples from other cities? For what percentage of the permanent population should a city be responsible for the homeless population? This question is especially in view that many have arrived from somewhere else, game the system, and don't want to change. So it's a percentage, empirical. How do you know when you're doing enough? Or what are you required to do?
So the goals of opening doors are to finish the job of ending chronic homelessness, to end veteran homelessness, to end homelessness among families, youth, and children, and set a path to ending all types of homelessness. And we take this seriously. One person experiencing homelessness is one too many. So when you ask about, has the federal government said what's an okay number of people to be experiencing homelessness, opening doors clearly outlines that we need an end to homelessness. And that last goal, setting a path to ending all types of homelessness, really speaks to having a system in the community that is coordinated, is responsive, is data-driven, and can be flexible enough so that when people are experiencing homelessness, there's a way to have capacity to connect people back to housing as quickly as possible. So we want homelessness to be rare. We don't want it to be something that happens. If it has to happen, it should happen very briefly, and it should only happen once in somebody's life. It shouldn't be an ongoing, durational way of life for people. When you think about budgets, I think the concept of sharing successes and finding communities that you feel akin to and working collaboratively is a really good way to start looking and teasing apart the budget. Because when you think about the costs of homelessness, it's spread out over multiple systems. Right now, there was some mentions about jail. That's a cost to the community. It's not necessarily coming out of even one line item in a budget, but it's something to think about. So you have general funds from your city, you have funds from your county, you can braid in federal funds and state funds or funds that the state has. Right now, the state of Florida has challenge grants that communities can apply for. So I don't think that there's a hard number, but I think what I would recommend is understanding of the 600 people, there's just a few more, 680 people who were identified in the point in time count. Start there and understand what type of housing capacity, what type of capacity is needed, and how can you use the existing resources in an efficient and smart way, and where are those gaps? And that'll draw a really good picture for you.
I want to respond to the idea about what number percentage we must shelter, and I think it's good to think about what your goals are as a community. So if you don't want people living in public space, if you don't want tourists to see it, if you don't want to see it, then clearly there has to be some alternative, because you cannot give someone life in prison for being homeless, right? So even if you send them to jail on an ordinance violation, that's pretty temporary, even if they get like the maximum sentence. And so I think that this kind of flows through to a bunch of different issues. I hear communities complain about, gosh, homeless people are urinating and defecating, in our downtown community. Well, are their bathrooms open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Because, you can't schedule these things between, 9 and 5 or, whenever the shelter's open. Well, there's too many people sleeping on the streets. Well, is there a shelter where people can stay? We don't like seeing homeless people pushing shopping carts and having their stuff. well, is there a place where they can leave their belongings during the day so that they're not chained to their things? I mean, you can't go to a job interview with your backpack and your bags and, all of that kind of stuff. We think homeless people look disheveled and messy and dirty. Well, are there showers? Are there things available to do that? And again, I'm not talking about homelessness, but I'm talking about addressing the symptoms and addressing those types of things. And so I think when you're talking about percentages of people that you shelter and whatever, I mean, I think it has to do with whether or not you want to do something about it or not. And then the other point I wanted to make, because I'm not sure if that was like a legal or a constitutional question, but I'll make it into one. It's no crime for a person to be homeless on your streets, just like you can't punish them for being homeless. But it's also, not a crime for cities to allow homelessness to exist, which, I think if we're, I think there's plenty of, discussions to be had about what causes homelessness and why. But, if you want to punish people for being homeless, if you want to use that as a strategy, you must have, I think the lesson of Pottinger is you must have some place for people to be. You cannot punish people for conduct arising out of an involuntary status constitutionally. And, if that's a strategy, which Miami took, that's 20 years worth of litigation that arose out of that. So anyway, those were, and then one other comment I wanted to make was the comment about people don't want to change. I hear this all the time, and who we're really talking about are chronically homeless people. When we talk about people don't want to change, we're talking about people who have been on the streets for 20 years. We're talking about people who people think are service resistant because they don't want to go into this program or that program, or they can't get sober to meet the requirements of this other program. And I think in these communities that have ended chronic homelessness, what they found is that the same people that the community thought, well, they just don't want to change, when they've actually used a research-based intervention, that in fact, yes, they do want to. It's just that the programs that they had were not fitting the needs of that individual.
I've got one here. I think you know this person. The city hired homeless expert Robert Marbut to deal with the homeless problem. Does his strategy really work in other communities as he claims?
I guess that's me. Did someone ask who's Robert Marbut? Well, I think he came to your community and he wrote a report. I've seen it. He's a homeless consultant who kind of made his living out of San Antonio and has been making his rounds around Florida. I think the average is about $50,000 is the contract that he's been getting. A variety of communities have hired him: Volusia County, Sarasota, St. Petersburg, Pensacola. Just to answer the question about whether or not he's had success as he claims, I can't speak to what the success has been in that facility in San Antonio. It sounds from their statistics that it's both a unique facility in terms of how much money it costs to get that campus up and running and the success rate that they've had. But I can specifically speak to what I have observed personally in Pinellas County, which is, I heard him speak. He was in St. Johns County recently, and I've seen him speak in Pinellas as well. And I know that he is touting success in St. Petersburg, and how he counts success appears to be in terms of the numbers of people in public spaces. And I think that's a significant difference from the number of people who are not experiencing homelessness. Those are two different metrics. If you have people in your downtown area, and if you have people who have actually escaped homelessness. And what they did at his recommendation, and this has been his recommendation to a number of communities, I think here as well, is to open a low barrier shelter that's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In Pinellas County, it's actually located on the jail property in a jail annex, and it's run by the sheriff and a private security company. And I think the concept of having a low barrier shelter and the concept of having a place that you can go to 24 hours a day, you can store your belongings there, you can receive mail. I think all of those things are, positives, particularly if you want a place for someone to be. And that facility houses about 400 people. It's always at maximum capacity because of the numbers of people experiencing homelessness. Having said that, from talking to the homeless people who live in that community and who stay at that shelter, I would not want a facility like that in my community. Because the homeless people call it the jailter, because it's kind of a correctionalized shelter, and it operates out of this idea that homelessness is a deviant behavior that can be modified through a carrot and stick approach. And so when you come into the shelter, you first get a mat on the floor, kind of in a crowded area and a small place for your belongings. If you kind of earn your way through, case management and doing certain tasks, you can earn your way to a mat in a better location in the facility and, maybe more space for your belongings. And then if you really, earn your way up, you get to have a bunk, somewhere else. And an important feature of this is that there's no time limit on how long you can stay, which was a significant difference in their community. Most shelters had, 21 days, something like that you could stay at. But if you violate a rule, I've had people tell me this has happened, they took 2 towels instead of 1 towel at shower time, or they didn't put their mat away quick enough. You get put outside in what they call the penalty box, which is an outdoor courtyard that's outside, and it's in full view of anyone coming into the criminal justice system. You can see people just, living in this, fenced-in facility, and you're not allowed to use the bathrooms inside. You have to use a portalette outside. You only get a shower every couple of days. There's a lot of features to this that's very punitive, and as I said, the success rate that they've had is just that they have 400 people who were previously sleeping on the street now in an institution, but you still have 400 homeless people sleeping in that institution. And it's caused a lot of issues. Actually, there's a big controversy about the cost to EMS because they're making so many runs out to that facility because there's so many issues going on and things of that nature. So I think it's kind of a Band-Aid. I think it's questionable whether or not the behavior modification part of that is helping people, quote, graduate off the streets, which I believe is one of his terms. And I know he's also has said publicly that he's against housing first, and doesn't believe that it works, which is why he has this other system. Aside from what he says in speeches, I haven't seen any empirical studies that prove that this particular methodology of dealing with homelessness is more effective than the evidence-based strategies related to housing first.
Any other comment?
Yeah, I'd like to capitalize on that because I'm only generally familiar with Marbut, and I understand that the city of Key West may have consulted with him in terms of some of his proposals. You don't have to take us at our word, and I would urge you not to take Marbut at his word, but look at the evidence, look at the science. That's how you evaluate the efficacy of a policy, of social policy. Social policy should be informed by evidence and by science, and not by somebody's unilateral feelings as to how to cure deviant behavior. Ask that person, where do these proposals come from, and what is the evidence to support the efficacy of that proposal? Housing First is not a new program. It's been around for, what, 5 years now? 4 years?
Even longer.
Longer.
Yes. There is science, there are statistics, there is evidence to support the efficacy of Housing First. It's been evaluated, it's been studied, and it's been demonstrated to have a 95% or more success rate. That is proven, and that is a fact. Ask Mr. Marbit, what is the science to demonstrate the efficacy of his proposals? Don't take our word for it, look at the science.
And I think in the spirit of open inquiry, asking questions, that's part of what USICH does, is we work with communities who develop models that are both unique to their environment, but also can be scaled up or replicated. And so we have a solutions database, and we gather this type of information so that you can compare and contrast and take pieces of what works and understand where the evidence points.
Any other responses to that? I want to acknowledge a group of questions that really probably this panel cannot answer, but the questions should be raised. For example, where will we get more supportive services like psychological and other services here in Key West rather than having to go to Miami for them? Coupled with what veteran services and programs to help the homeless are available in Key West and Monroe County? Why is the base realignment system no longer available when we have a military presence? That's how we got much of the permanent housing for homelessness in Key West and Monroe County, but currently all the excess seems to be going to private developers. Questions we probably can't answer. Can you give us a visual of what the homeless housing would look like? Is it dormitories, that is beds, meals, storage? Would it be in the center of town or out in the outskirts, like Stock Island? Stock Island, I may not think it's in the outskirts, but we'll leave that. What if residents don't return to their home for a night or several nights? Questions like that. There's not a specific model being advocated, but it's open for discussion. Here are the commonality of the questions. I'm going to close the question part with one last one. If the cost of criminalization for homelessness is instead moved to providing social and mental services, doesn't that just shift the cost from one agency to another rather than reduce it?
Well, I think the answer is yes, but the point is that you're already spending money on homelessness just by doing nothing about it, and you're not solving the problem. When you criminalize it, you're spending more money on homelessness, and you're not solving the problem. If you shift those resources to other services, now you've solved the problem, and yes, you're still spending money, but you're spending it in more effective ways that actually have success rates.
Anyone else want to respond? I want to make note of two comments that were made on two questions that we're not going to wrestle with, but these are sort of ponderables. Are the issues of and responses to homelessness very similar or parallel to issues and responses to immigration? And what about lobbyists who want people to populate their private jails and prisons? On that note, we're going to move to a time of comment, and I'm going to ask Mayor Craig Cates to come forward to the podium. He wanted to make some remarks to begin, and then we'll have some time for those who wish to speak to us on any of this that we've been talking about. We each get 2 minutes.
Thank you, Reverend Randy. I want to thank the panel for being here today, and the citizens for being here and taking such an interest in the issue. We just come off 2 years in a row of mayor election with homelessness was the top subject, and criminalizing homeless was one of the main subjects. And it's been a waste of money, and we need to address that and spend our money more effectively, obviously. I think you all have great intentions, but the idea of housing for the homeless is almost impossible down here. We got 2,000 people about that's working that can't have housing. So to move the homeless ahead of those people would just be unfair, and the community wouldn't support that. So I appreciate everything that you all. Hopefully we'll have discussions on a local level where we can address the issues in Key West and get together and solve our issues in Key West. And the biggest thing here, I appreciate bringing forward not to criminalize being homeless. Thank you.
Thank you. Sloan.
It's safe.
And if you do identify yourself, be helpful.
I'm Sloan Bushinsky. I was one of the mayor candidates until 2 days ago. I think I'm the only resident homeless expert in the room. That is because, like you, David, I have lived on the street in this town, on Maui. I have slept in shelters in Kansas City, Birmingham. Here, I've slept at cots. I've slept everywhere in Key West you can imagine outside. Craig is right. This city needs to focus on the people who just went homeless and can be saved quickly, and the people who are just about to go homeless for the same reason the people who just went homeless. The rents are out of sight here. We need about 1,500 affordable rental units, $600, $800, $900 a month. What we've got is much, much higher. My experience living on the street is 90% of the people who live on the street people, are addicts. They're using, and if they're still using, you're wasting your time putting them anywhere. So Key West needs a drunk tank for that. Put them in there, let them out when they're sobered up. You're killing the hospital, you're killing the sheriff without a drunk tank. I would like to know if there's any federal money, Amy, for housing. I don't think you said that. I'm not asking you to answer me right now. But I think a lot of it could come up if your boss, Mr. Obama, would quit fighting so many wars and spending so much money on the military. That would free up a heap amount of money for housing, hospital, health, all that.
Thank you. Yep. We'll wait. I just passed it on to you.
I got a solution for you. Been working on it for 7 months.
Okay. Yep, thank you.
And that's the schematic of it. It's a general schematic. My name is Skip O'Neill. I live in Key West. My family started in 1890 in Chicago. We're the largest construction company there. I started when I was 12 years old and did every 54 years of everything, but died almost 5 times. I've been thinking about this problem here I love it down here. I've been coming here for years. My daughter lives here. She's a boat captain, and it's a real problem with the homeless. 7 months ago, I came up with an idea. In fact, I shared it with the mayor, and it's called We Care Key West. I could be here probably for about 2 weeks to talk about what you all have been talking about, because it's a big problem. And it's all over the country, immigration, economy, and so on. What I've done is I want to do 1 acre of land in a pavilion and have an office to get the people jobs. I got a Dr. Shapiro for drugs for the mentally ill. You were talking about a psychiatrist I'm going to have an office for counseling of the AA and the drugs. I actually got a doctor that's going to be on my board. And the people have to pay $3 a day to stay there. It's totally secure, 24 hours a day. it's a pavilion, not a building. It'll be open to the air. We can flip down the sides if it got cold or some real bad problem. And but the most important thing, we don't want to keep them here. We want to educate them, maybe teach them some trades, something, and try to move them through the program. Try to get them jobs. An office, 2 or 3 people. I have right now 16 staff people. I'm going to run it like a corporation, and try to get the people through it, and get them jobs, and so on and so forth. And the ones, and you're wrong about the ones that, I think somebody said that there was 25% that people don't really care. I found there's about 50%. And I've gone out on the street myself and talked to over 40 people in the last 3 months. And then I went to the food kitchen.
Skip, that's your time. Thank you.
Just one minute.
One sentence.
I went to the soup kitchen over the Catholic run, and some of them would love to do my deal, and 50% tell me to go to hell.
Thank you.
So we'll
Come on up, whoever, line yourself up.
We'll work on the 50 good ones. If they don't want jobs, we don't want.
I'm David Rice, Monroe County Commissioner, but I wasn't always. In 1973, I moved to the Keys as a 29-year-old clinical psychologist to start community mental health treatment and substance abuse treatment in the Middle Keys. Most of you know that. Virginia, how are you? I really appreciate you being here today because you caused me to do a lot of thinking. You caused me to pull things together that I've learned over those years. And by the way, I don't consider myself a homeless expert. I've worked with the homeless for 40 years. I'm not an expert. I know something about the issue. There are 2 experts, local experts, sitting in this room. Sloan Bashinsky is one of them. Reverend Steve Braddock is another. There may be others, and if so, I apologize. But those are the folks I look up to on this particular subject. One thing that I've noticed over all of my years of being involved, communities will use whatever resources they have to address policies, whether they're effective or not. We do exactly that. Since about 1980, jails and prisons have become a growth industry in the state of Florida. While mental health funding in the state of Florida, I recently read, is 50th out of 50 states. That's the definition of our problem. One definition of our problem. Another idea, and this is really kicking some sacred cows, I'm sorry, Heather, and I'm not sure that I advocate for this because it is such a problematic area. But we build community resources, and I put in parentheses jail, and we obligate financing. Then when it fails to meet a problem, we leave the money in that program, and we either don't fund more promising alternatives or we underfund them. We don't take the money out of a jail, for example, and say, okay, here's $400,000 for something that has proved to be effective.
David, that's your time. Thank you.
I know that. Thank you very kindly. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah. No, I don't either. I was like,
Because it's going to cause problems.
oh, that's why.
Yeah, I have that, yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Trish Doherty Gibson. I am the Chief Assistant Public Defender, so I come at this issue in a slightly different manner than the last speakers. I don't have any ideas that are as lofty and fabulous as some that have been provided as to how to give housing to people. I do agree that we are limited space, horizontal, vertical, and it's going to be difficult, if ever, to get to that point. What I would like to point out is that this seminar is about the criminalization of homelessness. Maybe not necessarily how to get rid of homelessness, but how we stop criminalizing homelessness. Ms. Sawyer mentioned about Philadelphia. I lived in Philadelphia in the early 1990s. I believe Chief Willie Williams was the chief at the time of the Philadelphia Police. He then went on to the Los Angeles Police Department. Unfortunately, that was not a good career move for him. But at the time, he was spouting and asking for his police force to engage in what was called community policing. And we have people on the streets in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, in January and February, it is cold. And people stay on the streets. There are shelters, but there are many people that stay on the streets. And what I saw was police officers going out and giving blankets and soup and trying to help the people on the street instead of arresting them. And in return, those were the people that saw when a real crime went down. And if they were helped by the police, if they had the trust in the police, they turned around and gave information to the police when there was a real crime. And I think that we're missing the boat here and putting people in jail for minor crimes, I'll say, as opposed to utilizing the people that see what goes on in the streets. And so getting back to the criminalization of homelessness, I think we need to look at our resources and use the people, not use, I guess, but utilize what their information is. As far as how we deal with giving houses, that's above my pay grade. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you all so much for being here. You really have, I think, opened things up tremendously. The criminalization of the homeless is... Tell them who you are. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Chris Stone. Been here since 1976. I seem to find myself working with the homeless and doing social services work and things of that sort. For 2 years, I facilitated not a behavior mod program, thank you God, but a cognitive behavioral program, a healing program called Houses of Healing at MCDC. It was a 13-week program that I repeated over and over again. It was 3 hours per week, intensive, a closed group. And people said, well, you can't go teach men, they'll rape you. And I said, I don't think so. And well, you can't expect them to share anything, they're not going to share. Well, I never facilitated a group where virtually every man didn't cry at some time in that class, and every woman as well. I am working right now. I'm a member of AA, which we cannot say in the press, so we won't. But I have been sober for 27 years. I see a lot of homeless people. I see a lot of addicted people every single day. When I heard what they described as the homeless population here, I had to laugh. That was so undercounted. And half the people I saw that day, I said, were you counted? No. The guy who's been sleeping on my couch wasn't counted. Most of the people I know were not counted. Back to the criminalization, if I could just for a minute, and talking about health problems, both mental and physical health problems as they're associated with it. I know a fellow who was coming down here from another state, and he had undiagnosed acute prostatitis, which meant that he had to urinate very often. He went to a convenience store, said, can I use the facility? No, you can't, but you can go outside and pee behind the dumpster, which he did. He was arrested, served 30 days, and they shaved his head, okay? Then he walked the rest of the way to Key West.
That's your time, thank you.
Okay. I definitely will. Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name's Mark Sullivan, and I'm the clubhouse manager down at the Anchors Away Club. It's our 12-step recovery clubhouse here in Key West. I just got a couple of numbers I wanted to throw at you. We recently did a questionnaire and a survey anonymously as to the people who are frequenting the clubhouse, and it turned out that 36.6% of the attendees at the clubhouse were either homeless or in brand new transitional housing going on in Key West. Honestly, we see a lot of people who have just coming out of the back end of the system after being arrested and released, and they're often, in order to achieve housing here in town, most of the housing offers are including in some kind of 12-step recovery program. Being on the front lines, I can say my experience with this has been that these people are doing wonderful once they get in. It seems to me, from what I've seen, that the ability to have a place to crash for these people who may be dual diagnosed, maybe some mental issues and some addiction issues, having a steady place to be often helps them grasp and grapple with the other problems that are going on in their lives. You know, the mental illness and the addiction or alcoholism they're suffering with, if they have a little bit of grounding where they can actually sleep, get a good night's rest, be treated with some respect like a human being, it's amazing what I've seen. I've seen story after story, and I've been personally involved for a very long time. I've been in town since 1989. So I have seen so many people turn their lives around, going from homeless and on the streets to maybe getting a little bit of discipline in their lives and having a safe place to be and turning it around. The reason I wanted to come up here is because I heard comment about people not wanting to change. And I'm telling you right now, I'm living proof of it, and I'm on the front lines with it every single day, that when they have the chance to change, they definitely take advantage of it. Thanks.
Thank you.
And good afternoon. I'm Catherine Vogel. I'm the state attorney. Just a little bit of history, Mr. Waxman. You mentioned Pottinger. I lived in Miami back when Pottinger was an issue, and over 10 years ago, I was the chief assistant in Key West, Florida, when Mr. Kaufman came to me and pointed out that this was before COTS had been established, that people were being arrested for status crimes. And as the chief assistant, the Monroe State Attorney's Office stopped prosecuting those cases. We also, at that point, went to the county commission and pointed out that there was no homeless shelter in Monroe County. And as a result of that, COTS was established. We pointed out the Pottinger decision, and COTS came about as a result of that. So Pottinger had a very real effect here in Monroe County. I know that I'm preaching to the choir when I tell you that the Monroe State Attorney's Office, as well as most of the law enforcement, if I can speak on their behalf, will attest to the fact that the criminalization of the homeless does not work. I believe that the sheriff would also say that he does not want to house the homeless. As your state attorney, we do everything we possibly can when we find the homeless in the in the jails to find alternatives. If we find that there's alternative housing for them, we find ways to get them out of jail. If there's a family member that we can send them to, we'd much rather send them to a family member that will take them as opposed to incarceration. Anything that we can to reunite them, to find stable housing for them. I don't know what we can do as a community. I don't know that there's a will for housing, permanent housing. We have something called ROGO. I don't know how many of you know about that, and whether we're going to be able to dedicate ROGO units for permanent housing for homeless when we can't even provide affordable housing for the working poor. That being said, if anybody knows of anything, any other alternatives, we're certainly open for it, and certainly I'm sure that law enforcement would be willing to do anything we can to find alternatives for criminalizing homelessness. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Jay Harko. I am the HUD-VASH case manager working with the VA down here in Key West to house 30 recipients of HUD-VASH vouchers. We finally on Tuesday housed the last of those within Monroe County. But if there is anyone in the audience, thank you for being here, giving me this opportunity to say, if there is a veteran out there who needs help, we are on this island and we are here to help. We have a social worker, a clinical psychiatrist, we have a full staff of medical help. They need to get their DD-214, which they would do here in this building through Veterans Affairs, and come on over to our VA clinic located for us conks at the Old Navy Hospital. For you new to the area, right as you come onto the island there at the military base at the left of the triangle, and I think it is back to being a triangle again. Don't hesitate to make a referral. I personally worked with our state's attorney to move one of our veterans, a female who served and had a connection in New York, to that facility and get services for somebody who had gone through a lot of trauma and become homeless and wound up in our jail system. It does work if we work with people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Peter Dzwonek. Thank you for your presentation. I'm formerly homeless. I'm now with Volunteers of America. We provide very limited housing for veterans. Jay and the clinic are a big help to us. We work together. At some point, I realized, but I'm not sure everybody else realizes, that homelessness is a problem that affects the whole community. And I believe it's going to take the whole community working together if we're going to make any progress on getting this thing set right. This housing model going on across the country, maybe you've heard of 100,000 Homes Project. I don't even care if financial concerns overcame the compassion part, because it's being done. And when I first looked at homelessness in Key West, I realized that asking for housing is like, maybe it's too big of a step for Key West. I would be so happy to see a 24-hour shelter with case management to get people help in getting away from homelessness. The housing, hopefully, maybe that can come on down the road, you know? And I think what's gonna do it, sadly, is gonna be financial motivation. But as long as it works, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you all for being here today. My name is Jay Somers. I'm with the Florida Keys Children's Shelter. I direct the street outreach program called Project Lighthouse. I'm working with young people who are at risk or are on the streets up to 21 years old, and our program philosophy is to regard them with the utmost humanity and respect as young travelers. So I appreciate your comments, Mr. Peary, about regarding our language that we use. I also want to thank you, Ms. Sawyer. I think it was your words that I really appreciate having a term to use, that these are active living crimes. Might have been Ms. Clayton instead, but I really appreciate having that sort of perspective. We all feel there's a challenge to us with the city ordinances in particular that are very much used to arrest folks who are experiencing homelessness. And they are very unhelpful. But to have that phrased in a, it's a living crime, you have to live. And I respect you all and appreciate you really pushing the concept of people have constitutionally protective rights. And I think that that's definitely a point as a community we need to remember at all times. And we do work very hard to look for solutions. This is an ongoing question. I've been to many of these meetings, and I've seen many of you folks here too. I'd like to remind everyone that while we're trying to build more housing options, intact family housing units need to be one of our priorities. One of the largest and fastest growing populations of who is homeless are young people. Those are either young people who are abandoned or unaccompanied, but they are also young children with parents who are facing those combination of difficulties that move them into a homeless situation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to call Scott Pridgeon up to the podium. He is the chair of the Continuum-of-Care, and as such, he's going to bring us our closing words for today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Scott Pridgeon. I'm the Executive Director for AIDS Help, as well as the Chair of the Monroe County Homeless Continuum of Care. The continuum, we refer to it as the MCOC for short, because it is a rather long title, but the MCCOC is made up of 43 social services agencies in Monroe County. We are on the front lines every day, connecting people that are homeless to care. Some of that care is in the form of housing. Some of that care is in the form of the continuum applying for grants, such as the Challenge Grant that was mentioned, as well as other HUD grants that are possible for us to house people in our community who have a definition of homeless. This is a very complex issue. It affects our community as a whole. One of the things that I've heard today that I want to emphasize is empathy. We must, as a community, look at people as people. We must look at housing as housing. Everyone in this room, everyone outside of this room deserves a home and a place to live. The COC works very hard every day in order to make that dream for someone, as well as connect them to the services that they may need, such as substance abuse or mental health. We ask for this community's help in our mission. We ask for you to get involved with us, to come to our meetings. We meet on is it the second Thursday, Steve? The second Thursday of every month, which we usually meet at the Wesley House. But it's open to the public. It's open to everyone to come in. You can become a member if you like. But again, it is a membership that is made up of all of the social services in Monroe County that are working very hard every day in order to find solutions for those who are living on our streets. I want to thank our panel today. They've been absolutely excellent. I think that they have opened the eyes and ears to a lot of people in this room, but I want to specifically say what you've heard today and what you've seen today, take out there. Take out there, spread the message, get involved. Thank you very much.
And so for all of us here in the room, for the panel and everyone else, let's rise up and give ourselves a round of applause for dealing with this instead of ignoring it. Thank you all. So much. So good. Thank you.
Oh, okay, cool.
Give that back to
Good morning, Keita.
I don't know what we're doing with that.
Cool.
You're supposed to skip.
Thank you. LLM, where'd you get your LLM at?